All right, let's dive into 19th century imperialism. Now, this is a topic you probably think you know. But what if I told you the simple reasons we all learned in school? Well, they're just scratching the surface. The real story is so much more complex and, frankly, way more revealing.
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard this one, right? God, gold, and glory. It's the classic textbook answer. It's catchy, it's easy to remember, and for a long, long time, it was pretty much the standard explanation for why European empires spread across the globe.
But what if that's way too simple? Today, we're going to peel back those layers because underneath that catchy phrase are the powerful ideologies that truly fueled this entire era. You see, this isn't just a story about conquering land. It's a story about how that conquest was justified. So, to really get what was going on, we have to look past those three words and really unpack the ideological engine that was driving everything. This wasn't just a random land grab. It was powered by this incredibly potent and interconnected web of beliefs. And this is the key, right here. Building an empire takes more than just armies and ships. It takes a story. A really, really powerful story that empires tell themselves and the rest of the world to make their actions seem not just necessary, but actually righteous. Okay, so that big, powerful story, it was basically built on four main pillars. We're going to break down these major ideologies that created the intellectual and, you could say, the moral framework for all of this imperial expansion. So, here's our roadmap for the next bit. We've got nationalism, then scientific racism, social Darwinism, and finally, this idea of the civilizing mission. And the thing you've got to remember is that these ideas didn't exist in a vacuum. Nope, they all fed into each other, reinforcing one another and creating this incredibly strong ideological structure. All right, first up, we've got nationalism. The 19th century was just buzzing with this stuff. Think about the unifications of Italy and Germany. These were huge deals. Suddenly, people's main identity wasn't about their local king anymore. It was about the bigger, more abstract idea of the nation. But here's the thing about nationalism. It's a total double-edged sword. On the one hand, yeah, it creates this powerful sense of us, a shared identity. But on the other hand, that pride can easily curdle into a feeling of superiority, this belief that my nation is the best and we deserve to be on top. This sparked this fierce competition, and it turned international politics into this giant game of risk, where every nation was scrambling to gobble up territory just to prove they were the most powerful. Now, this is where things get, well, really disturbing. This intense national pride got supercharged by what was passed off as science. They used these pseudosciences, like phrenology, which was literally measuring the bumps on people's skulls to rank their intelligence, to create these really rigid racial hierarchies. And the craziest part? This wasn't seen as some fringe theory. It was presented as objective, legitimate scientific fact. It was the perfect example of twisting data to fit the conclusion you already want. Okay, so right in the middle of all of this, a guy named Charles Darwin comes along and publishes his revolutionary theory of natural selection. And in the world of biology, this was a game changer. It was a whole new way to understand how life evolves based on adaptation and survival. But, and this is a huge but, that brilliant scientific idea got completely twisted and misapplied to human society. This new philosophy was called social Darwinism. The argument was as simple as it was brutal. If survival of the fittest is the law of nature, well, then it must be the law for nations too. It basically gave them a scientific-sounding excuse for powerful countries to dominate so-called weaker ones. It was just natural. And this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the one that put a kind of moral polish on the whole thing. It was called the civilizing mission. This was the idea that the great imperial powers had a noble duty, a responsibility, to bring progress, Christianity, and proper government to what they saw as the uncivilized parts of the world. But, as you can see right here, there was a massive difference between the promise and the reality on the ground. I mean, sure, some schools and hospitals got built, but that often came at a terrible price. Indigenous cultures were suppressed, Western values were forced on people, and the whole thing was often just a mask for raw economic exploitation and total political control. It was like trying to do good with one hand while taking everything you could with the other.
So when you step back and look at the whole picture, it really is like a perfectly orchestrated symphony of justifications. You've got nationalism providing the competitive drive. You've got scientific racism creating the us versus them hierarchy. Social Darwinism comes in to say that domination is just natural. And then the civilizing mission sweeps in to give the whole enterprise a shiny moral gloss.
Okay, so that's the history. But why should we care about any of this today? Well, because imperialism isn't neatly tucked away in the past. Its shadow is long and it continues to shape our modern world in some really profound ways. I mean, just think about it. Those random borders drawn on a map by Europeans with no regard for the people who actually lived there, they're still fueling conflicts to this day. A lot of the global economic inequality we see is deeply rooted in those old colonial systems. And the dominance of Western languages and cultural norms around the world, yep, that's a direct legacy too. So just take a second and think about it. Where do you see these echoes today? Maybe in the news you watch, in global politics, or even in our own unspoken cultural assumptions. The connections are absolutely everywhere once you start looking for them. Look, the point of digging all this up isn't about pointing fingers or feeling guilty about the past. It's about learning from it. It gives us a critical lens that we can use to view our own world and a chance to avoid repeating the same patterns. The real work, the real challenge, is turning that lens on ourselves. It's about asking tough questions. Do we still hold on to subtle ideas about superiority? Do we make assumptions about what progress or development ought to look like for other people and other cultures? It's easy to judge the past. It's a lot harder to examine our own blind spots. So what can we do? How do we avoid falling into the same traps? Well, it starts with a few things. First, we have to constantly question our assumptions. Second, we have to be really skeptical when we hear high-minded, noble-sounding ideals being used to justify what is clearly an unequal system. And third, we have to get better at recognizing when good intentions might just be a cover for a desire for power or control. And that brings us to the big final question, right? This knowledge isn't supposed to be passive, it's a tool. By understanding the ideological engine that drove the past, how can we be more aware in our present? And how can we actively work to build a future that is truly more just and equitable for everyone?